Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 335. This week the questions are taken from guide 409 on the St Vincent class battleships and the Wednesday video on naval engineering, a brief history of turrets. So let's get on with questions. Stevie Bird asks, do we know if any dreadnoughts ever did fire a salvo dead ahead in either war, i.e. did the disadvantage of having wing turrets and flat bows ever pay off? Outside of fleet exercises, I'm not aware of any dreadnought with wing turrets specifically going full bow on and then firing a salvo consisting of its forward guns plus both wing turrets at an enemy. And in most of the fleet exercises that were carried out, it was usually noted that when you did fire the wing guns dead ahead, it tended to do some fairly nasty things to the deck and sometimes the associated superstructure nearby. With that said, there are a number of cases where ships with wing turrets were chasing ships very close to being dead on the bow, and of course at that point they could fire the appropriate wing turret, whether port or starboard, together with the forward armament. But then that raises the question of, well, like say with Dreadnought here, if you had a pair of turrets super firing forward, you'd still be able to fire 4 guns in that direction, assuming that the aft turrets couldn't bear as well, which is the same as having the wing turrets, only with the wing turrets you're still carrying an extra pair of guns that are a little bit of a dead weight. There are some instances of ships with wing turrets engaging a target that, let's say, is off to their port side, so they're able to fire whatever aft guns can be brought to bear, plus the port wing turret or turrets, in the case of things like the Nassaus or Helgolands, plus the forward guns, and then as the target crosses their bow from port to starboard, obviously that masks the port wing turret or turrets, the forward gun might still be reloading, and then the starboard wing turret or turrets can then immediately engage, which gives you a slight technical advantage over having a pair of super firing turrets forward, because in that kind of scenario, both of your forward superfiring turrets, say if you were a South Carolina class, would still be in the process of reloading. So it does give you a little bit of extra firepower, but that's a very unique situation. And even then, you're only getting 2 or 4 additional shots off for an advantage of maybe 30 seconds or so. The theory behind wing turrets, at least for a head fire, is fine. The problem is more so in the execution, and with a very limited cross-deck bearing on the turrets. It means if you want to actually fire, in Dreadnought's case, a full 6-gun forward, well, it's not even a broadside at that point, a 6-gun salvo, you essentially have to be absolutely dead on, which is a actually surprisingly difficult position to achieve. Of course, there are other reasons why wing turrets existed, depending on the ship, either in terms of machinery taking up most of the amidships and centerline portion of the ship, or for whatever reason, a desire not to have, or an inability to have, super firing turrets and so forth. But those are obviously separate matters for discussion. Connor McLernan asks, in terms of ship classes where a variety of designs were put forth and one was selected to be taken forward, which one do you think the Navy in question made the wrong choice in, given the actual circumstances that the class ended up in? There's a whole load that I think you could fairly successfully argue for. For the Royal Navy, for example, the 2 biggest ones that stand out would probably be the Queen Elizabeths going with the larger tube boilers, because Jellicoe was persuaded by the shipyards. That's something I've mentioned quite a few times before. As I said, he's gone on record as saying, well, if he'd gone with his instinct and gone with small tube boilers, the QEs might push 27, 28 knots, which could have a huge number of knock-on effects. I mean, for one thing, it would make them actual proper fast battleships all the way through into the Second World War, and having, another 5 fast battleships in said war would have helped the Royal Navy quite considerably. But also, having ships that fast and that powerful in the First World War might have been so overwhelming an advantage, it could even compensate for Beatty and Seymour being absolute screw-ups, because even if 5th Battle Squadron had missed the memo, well, obviously with Seymour's poor signalling at the Battle of Jutland, if they were capable of 27 or 28 knots, they might have caught up in time, possibly to save Queen Mary, but even if they didn't save Queen Mary, certainly to give the scouting group a heck of a lot more of a pounding before they managed to reach the High Seas Fleet. Although it's not quite a we could do this or this, it's more of a, well, we thought about this, but then we moved on to this. I would say that perhaps some variant on the F3 battlecruiser would, in retrospect, be a better choice than Nelson and Rodney's 03 design being taken forward, because at the end of the day, although obviously Rodney got into a scrap with Bismarck, neither ship actually took main caliber gun hits, at which point the somewhat greater protection of the Nelson class isn't quite so relevant when you compare it to, again, the F3s being capable of moving considerably faster and therefore adding even more fast battleships to the Royal Navy's theoretical inventory come World War II. And potentially also by allowing the Navy to standardise on the 15-inch gun, perhaps giving us a 9-15-inch gun King George V instead of the 10-14-inch variant that we got instead. You could potentially also argue the Akizuki and Shimakaze type destroyers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, although that's a little bit odd, because the Akizukis were very good destroyer designs, but as I mentioned in the destroyer development video, weirdly enough, the Akizukis, which were supposed to be escort destroyers, ended up doing a lot of frontline offensive work, and the Shimakaze, which was the sole example of what was supposed to be an offensive destroyer, ended up doing a lot of escort work. So I suppose you could argue they should have swapped over, but then at the same time, you know, if they built loads of Shimikazes essentially in one Akizuki. But you could argue that given the weird switch around of use cases, the Japanese Navy might have just switched them around again anyway. Now, an interesting, if somewhat controversial one for the US Navy with the Essex class carriers, because there were variants of the Essex class design that were considered with an armoured flight deck. Now, I know what you're going to say, reduced air groups, etc., etc. But there were a lot of different variants considered. The main hobbling of the Essex class, in fact, probably its single largest design weakness, and let's face it, they didn't have too many design weaknesses, was the fact that although a largely treaty-free design, the Essex was still designed with side armour and placement of deck armour to resist cruiser gunfire. Light cruiser gunfire, but cruiser gunfire nonetheless. That was the main problem. When you see a lot of the Essex armoured flight deck variants that were put forward, and you see the air group being cut down to very small amounts, that's because they're maintaining a 4-inch side belt and still having an armoured hangar deck, because that's the deck level that's the highest they can armour to protect themselves from shells. Whereas if you look at one or two suggestions where they go, look, let's not armour our carriers against cruiser-grade gunfire, let's instead just armour them against bomb, blast and splinters, then we can save the weight from that and move the armoured deck up to the level of the flight deck, and we can maintain a mostly open hangar to warm up our air groups, and we can maintain a nice large hangar for said air groups, thus we can keep the air group sizes up. And obviously the advocates for that are saying this will be a much better choice for carrier survivability. So essentially what you would get is an Essex class that still has the air group of the historic Essex class, but by having an armoured flight deck rather than an armoured hangar deck, you think of all those men who lost their lives in massive disasters like Bunker Hill and Franklin, and also the number of carriers that were knocked offline and had to go back for repairs after being hit by kamikazes and bombs, especially during the Okinawa campaign, and the knock-on effect of not having their combat air patrol groups available to take out other kamikazes that went after ammunition ships and destroyers and store ships and everything. in my opinion, if they had decided, yeah, actually we are going to ditch this cruiser grade armour protection for the Essexes and just essentially given them an armoured flight deck hat, they would have been in a much, much better circumstance. John Batty asks, what effect do you think a triple turret would have on Royal Navy designs if it had been adopted on the St Vincent class? Could it lead to triples becoming the norm and thus prevent the design of the quadruple turret on the King George V class, or was the quad turret more for weight optimization and a bit of a hangover of the treaty era combined with a lack of funds to support design changes? The potential effects and knock-on benefits of a triple turret design, especially I think of the three that were looked at on balance, this one with 3 triples amidships, would be absolutely huge on the Royal Navy, because historically, even going into the 1930s, the Royal Navy was still one of those ones that considered 4 twin turrets to be the optimal layout, because apart from Nelson and Rodney, they essentially never had any experience operating triples, and there was a little bit of residual PTSD from the issues that those turrets had had early on going into service, although that wasn't really to do with them being triples, more to do with them being cut down and lightened to fit treaty restriction displacements, but nevertheless. If something as early as the St Vincent's had displayed a triple turret, then arguably it would have allowed the Royal Navy to have what I would term second generation dreadnoughts with Colossus, Neptune and Hercules, because of course those all still had wing turrets, whereas if you've got an all centerline triple arrangement, then assuming that there's no major technical issues with that going forward, those later 12-inch ships probably also would have had them. Perhaps as an upgrade you would have seen some variant on the 4 triple turret St Vincent layout, which would have given them a somewhat more firepower on the broadside. And then, of course, once you move forward to the 13.5-inch gun ships, which have 5 twin turrets, giving them 10 guns, you could either see a almost World War II-ish layout of 3 triple turrets with 9 guns and a huge amount of weight and space saving, allowing for potentially more armour, or possibly even still 12 guns with 4 triples, kind of like what the US standards would standardise on, except obviously the US standards standardising on 14s rather than 13.5s. And, forward on to the Queen Elizabeths, perhaps 3 triple 15-inch, which would give them an additional gun, and then so on and so forth moving forward. The ability to concentrate firepower and potentially also have more firepower could lead to a whole slew of design changes and upgrades, especially with things like Hood, Renown, Repulse. And then going forward, as you said, you might end up with the 3 triple 15 KGV being a fairly standard design because no one's really going to argue with it. Tim Gosling asks, I came across an oddity in the Wikipedia page for the Liberte, a French pre-dreadnought which self-destructed at Toulon in a similar way to the St Vincent class Vanguard but 6 years earlier, but apparently due to a similar cause. The Liberte explosion apparently occurred in the forward propellant magazine, destroying the front half of the ship, but the graphic that the wiki and other sources use to show damage shows an explosion amidships and the wreckage bent over the stern. It looks like the same ship, but why doesn't it agree with the description? Initially I thought, that's a bit weird, because, as you said, Liberte was destroyed by an explosion in the forward magazines. And then I thought, maybe they've mixed it up with Iena, because Iena was destroyed by an explosion or a series of explosions in roughly the position seen in this diagram. But then I checked out photographs of Iena's explosion, and it's nowhere near as violent as this. I mean, it's gutted the ship, but it hasn't blown it in this manner. I think what's happened here is just that some illustrator at the time has gotten the details a little bit wrong, and then because it's a period drawing, it's just been reused ad nauseum, because the overall shape of that peeled back deck is accurate. If you look here, for example, this is an actual photo of the wreck of Liberte after the explosion, but I think they've just got the whole thing the wrong way round. which, given that that was pretty much all that was left above the water, is somewhat understandable. But if you have a look here, this is the salvage plan, and you can see that the stern area is mostly intact, and it's the bow area that's completely gone. And then you see this, which is the hull in port after it has been salvaged, and you can see that, yeah, the stern area has not been ripped in half, but you can see there just to the right that a good chunk of the bow is missing. So I think what's happened is, given that the ship mostly sank, and this is kind of what they were left looking at, some period illustrator has just gotten it the wrong way around, published that in some magazine, which has then become a default go-to, and nobody's stopped to correct it. Ben Hammond asks, secondary armament atop main battery turrets. It doesn't seem like a pleasant station to serve. Were they effective? And how was ammunition supplied for them? Well, there's two flavours of secondary armament aboard turrets. So in the pre-First World War period, and theoretically into the First World War as well, you have guns like this. These are the 12-pounders on HMS Dreadnought. There would also be 4-inch guns on the Bellerophon's turrets and so forth. And then in World War II, as you can actually still see, either with just the mounting points or in some cases the whole mounts, in World War II, sometimes 40mm guns were placed on turret roofs. And they're two very different things. The secondary AA guns in the Second World War tended to be quite effective because, obviously being mounted on a turret, you had a fantastic field of fire. And in terms of ammunition, you'd make use of the ammunition clips that were stored in your, usually a quad Bofors or sometimes a twins, mounting. If you needed more, you could have more brought up via the ladders attached to the turrets, but that wouldn't usually be done in action. But it was a good use of the available space since, well, if you're under air attack, the chances of the main guns being in operation are very, very low, unless you're Yamato, which didn't have 40mm Bofors, so there you go. In terms of the First World War ones, initially, Dreadnought was only supposed to have a single 12-pounder on its turrets, and that 12-pounder was actually linked to the 12-inch guns and wasn't for anti-torpedo boat defense so much as it was to help with gun drill for the 12-inch guns. So by directly linking it to the 12-inch guns, it meant you would train and elevate you train the turret, elevate the guns, and of course as you turn the turret, so too with the 12-pounder go with it, you elevate the guns, and by the linkage, the 12-pounder would elevate, and then instead of firing the 12-pounder, you would fire instead of firing the 12-inch, you would fire the 12-pounder, and then you would judge your accuracy, fall of shot, etc., based off of that, which saved the gun barrels from wear, which in turn obviously extended the overall lifespan of the ship's main armament. But when they were looking at an anti-torpedo boat battery, they found that, obviously given that an all-big gunship was a new design, the primary 12-pounder battery, which they'd installed on the main decks in the forecastle and quarterdeck, was actually far too subject to gun blast, and in the stowage positions they had to shield them from gun blast while the main guns were in operation, they were very difficult to actually pull out and set up. And so Dreadnought ended up with first double 12-pounders on her wing turrets, and then double 12-pounders pretty much on every turret. And then the Bellerophons would have 4 inches instead, and so on and so forth. And this was essentially because of those blast effects, and because people hadn't started putting casement-mounted secondaries on dreadnoughts just yet. So this was pretty much the only place that they felt they could put them, other than obviously later on people stopped putting the guns in the superstructure. Although, of course, the flip side to that is that Dreadnought didn't have a lot of superstructure where you could install 12-pounders. Now, in terms of their effectiveness, much like the Second World War anti-aircraft guns, they obviously had a very good field of fire. Being positioned on the turret roofs doesn't actually subject you to too much gun blast compared to what you might think, bearing in mind that pressure diagram I've shown several times before. Although, again, ideally, if you are engaging enemy torpedo boats, you probably aren't using your main armament and the secondary armament at the same time. Although, obviously, especially in the First World War, both sets of armament might be employed, or you might have the 12-inch guns engaging an enemy battle line while torpedo boats make attacks. So you do have to factor that in. But ammunition supply would, for Dreadnought's guns, for example, and for pretty much most of this type, would be quite convoluted. So you would have to have a certain amount of ready-use ammunition up there, which would be taken up at the time the ship went to action stations. But otherwise, the 12-pounder magazines, say on Dreadnought, are located in one or two spaces. You then have to hoist those up, and they exit the hoist of the 12-pounders round about the superstructure, and then you would have to have people ferrying that ammunition out to the base of the turrets and then up ladders to the guns. So ideally you would see off the enemy torpedo attack with your ready-use ammunition, because your resupply would be fairly slow. And again, as long as that resupply is done on whichever side of the ship isn't engaging with the main guns, the blast effects from the main guns shouldn't be too bad for the crew doing the resupply. Warrant Officer Will asks, during World War II, did the Germans ever think of looking at the captured French fleet for inspiration into turret design, with the French's latest designs fitting 3 or 4 guns, while the Germans are still struggling with twins? Do any future versions of German plans take any cues from the French for more efficient turret design? No, on several grounds. The first of which is that the Germans didn't have direct access to any modern major French capital ships or cruisers up until they took over Vichy France in 1942, at which point the French fleet in Toulon scuttled itself, as you can see here. And of course, ships like Jean Bart and Richelieu weren't in mainland France, which rather limits when the Germans could use access to those ships more than any others as any kind of inspiration. Secondly, of course, is that date, which means that, well, the Germans aren't completing any serious capital ship designs at that point forward. As I've said before, the H-39s were definitely serious. The H-41s were somewhat serious, but H-42 onwards were basically fantasy pipe dreams to keep the designers away from being sent to the Eastern Front. So even if there had been a triple or a quad turret suggested for, say, H-43 or H-44, you couldn't really say that's a serious design change. And then on top of that, you have the fact that regardless of what the French may or may not have been doing, the German Navy was wedded to Krupp as the suppliers of its guns, and Krupp decided you were having sliding breech blocks, and that was that. And if you didn't like it, well, you could go somewhere else. And therefore, it would be pretty much impossible to implement triple or quadruple turrets along the lines of those on French warships, even if they had access to them from the fall of France, because French warships didn't include things like the extra spacing that you needed either side of a sliding breech block, like I pointed out in last month's Drydock series, and the subsequent relocation of facilities. You didn't need the extra weight at the back to balance the guns, which you could avoid with a interrupted screw breech block. For example, the Italians with the Littorios, using an interrupted screw breech on near enough exactly the same weight, managed to build a slightly larger gun with a larger breech chamber using a slightly more powerful and heavier propellant charge, firing a slightly longer and slightly heavier armor-piercing shell at higher speeds. Now, obviously, you do have the inaccuracy issue probably to do with overstabilization, but that's not a reflection of the engineering of the gun in and of itself. That's more the calculations for rifle twisting. But in any case, essentially, the Italians managed to make a more powerful gun firing a better shell on the same weight, partially because they were using an interrupted screw breech rather than a sliding breech block. You also don't need an extractor for the brass cartridge on a French turret design. You don't need the long rail that takes that brass cartridge away, or the ejection mechanism, etc., etc. So as long as you remain wedded to the Krupp sliding block breech loading system, you are also wedded to an extremely large turret, and therefore the fact that the French have invented triple and quadruple turrets isn't really going to help you, unless, I suppose, you were willing to consider an H-43 or H-44 design as actually serious, which, you know, that's a mistake already. But if you did, then in theory you could scale up a French triple or quad as long as you were willing to stick with, you know, Bismarck-style 15-inch guns or something like that. Primark359 asks, during the pre-barbette period, were there any 3-gun turrets? It seems the style of the gun mounts in the diagrams for this period would make them such a gun turret much less complex than in the age of dreadnoughts. Initially it might seem that way, and I can understand why you'd come to that conclusion, because of course pre-barbette, when you're talking sort of early to mid ironclad period, a lot of the turret designs are simply circular gun houses, and essentially each gun is an independent operator within that turret. However, there are a couple of problems. First of all, the actual diameter of the guns is actually slightly larger on average than you would get for corresponding calibers in the age of steam and steel, partly because, well, in fact mostly because of materials being less capable of standing up to the pressures, even though obviously pressures would increase going forward into long distance fire, etc. But look at a preserved 11 or 15-inch Dahlgren and compare the bore with just how fat the thing is. It's not a huge margin overall, but it is something to consider. But the much, much larger part of the problem is, well, twofold. Firstly, because pretty much all the turrets in the pre-barbette period are just circular, that means if you have a single gun, great, it just pokes out the center. If you have 2 guns, as you can see with some of the diagrams here, you have to put them quite close together in order to fit them out of the turret. If you have 3 guns, you could make the turret larger, but now because you have a continuous curve across the front, either your center gun is not going to be sticking out of the turret as much as you'd want it to, or the left and right hand guns are going to be sticking out considerably more than you want them to, which could create problems with reloading, especially when you're using muzzle loaders. Breech loaders, somewhat less of a problem, then it becomes more an issue of blast and elevation. But even more so on top of all of that is the fact that these ships are nowhere near as wide as ships would be later on. So if you look at the first ships, for example, to mount triple 12-inch guns, so that'd be the Tegethoffs and the Dante Alighieri, the Italian ship has a beam of just under 90 feet, when it's actually a fraction over 87 feet, and the Tegethoff has a beam of just over 91 feet, and that's for triple 12-inch. An ironclad of the mid-ironclad period, let's say Devastation through to Sansparai, and looking at various foreign ships as well, generally their beam is somewhere between 65 and 75 feet, give or take a foot or two, and that obviously is substantially narrower, which limits the width of turret you can support before you get stability issues and issues with the turret mechanism occupying too much of the width of the hull generally for other purposes like getting past it, etc. And then factor in, of course, that an awful lot of those ships are mounting guns that are heavier than a 12-inch and therefore even wider, not accounting for the few inches extra width you might have per gun anyway compared to a steel version at the same caliber. And suddenly you realise there just wasn't the space on those earlier ships for a 3-gun or triple turret. Now, in theory, you could have potentially developed a triple turret for a smaller caliber weapon, but then you would have 3 guns that wouldn't be capable of punching through the primary armor protection of your target, at which point it's a pointless exercise. Admiral asks, how were ironclads and pre-dreadnoughts reloaded? Was reloading the guns like that of modern battleships? There are quite a few different ways of reloading a gun in the period that you sort of mentioned. By the early to mid pre-dreadnought period, shells are basically being reloaded pretty much the same as they would be in, if you like, modern battleships, aka dreadnoughts. But before that, you literally run the entire gamut. So if you go all the way back to the first ironclads, Gloire and Warrior, those guns are being reloaded pretty much exactly the same way that you would reload the cannon on something like HMS Victory. About the only difference between reloading a 68-pounder on Warrior and a 32-pounder on Victory is that, well, one shell or shot is considerably heavier than the other, so you probably need a couple of people to help you maneuver that into place. albeit obviously you do also have the 110-pounder breech loaders on Warrior, and in that case, although you are loading from the other end of the gun, it is still entirely a manual process. In that case, you have 2 or 3 people picking up the shot or shell, shoving it in, and then putting the charge in behind, and then closing up the breech in the rather happily unique way that breech loading was done with that Armstrong 110-pounder, which at some point I really have to do a video on to explain why it was so awful. But moving forward, if you have a muzzle loader, for a few years it's still a case of, well, just use a couple more men, but essentially, shove powder in, then shove shell in, then or shot, and then tamp it all down. But eventually the guns get too large for that, and in some cases that's sooner rather than later. So for example, in the American Civil War, you have 11-inch and 15-inch Dahlgrens coming along considerably sooner than you would have 12-inch or 13-inch guns in some other navies. And once you get to that stage, you start to need some form of mechanical assistance, whether that's a manually operated chainfall to lift the shell into position, or as you go further and further along, as you can see here for the 16-inch guns on Inflexible, you have to lower the gun because there's not enough room in the turret for it to recoil far enough back. You actually have to lower the gun barrel to a reloading mechanism outside, which essentially looks sort of like the reloading mechanism you'd see in a later period dreadnought, for example, except in reverse. So instead of the rammer ramming in first the shell and then the charge and then you close up the breech, in this case the rammer is ramming in the powder and then the shell, and is also having to do some of the sponging out because we are still talking about a black powder weapon. One of the more rapid implementations of some form of mechanical assistance is, of course, getting ammunition up out of the magazines, because there's a difference between, let's say, a 110-pounder shell or shot on Warrior being manhandled by 2 or 3 people from the deck into the breach, and somebody running up from the magazines the way you might do on Victory with a 32-pounder or 24-pounder shot. And so again, initially manually operated mechanical stuff, later power loaded, although even then you had to, on many early turrets, align the turret in a very specific direction in order to receive ammunition, because since the whole thing was essentially on one gigantic spindle or on rollers, but it was still one whole mechanism as opposed to on a modern turret, the fully enclosed barbette, the magazine would be fixed, the turret would rotate, and so you would have a hatch for passing up ammunition, but that only came into alignment, as I said, on a specific direction. Whereas later on, with a full barbette, you could have the entire hoist mechanism built into the rotating portion of the turret. So essentially, as time goes on through the ironclad period, individual elements like mechanically assisted hoists, mechanically assisted loading, rammers, powered hoists, separation of charge hoists and shell hoists, etc., will all gradually come into play. So you'll see elements being introduced, but putting them all together into the mechanism that you would recognize as a modern battleship's loading mechanism only really comes about in, realistically, the pre-dreadnought period. You could make some argument for some of the very late ironclads, but it's mostly pre-dreadnought. Ivan asks, I can't find any information on the reason why carriers needed a third elevator down the middle of the ship, and why putting it on the deck edge in case of the Essex class, for example, was a large improvement. There's a lot of discussion to be had about that question. It's a pretty good one, which would probably fill its own Friday video, possibly a Wednesday video, but very briefly to cover some of the highlights. When you're looking at World War II aircraft carrier development, I think we need to split it into two. Why do you need a third elevator? And then separately, why is a deck edge elevator a good choice for that? So the reason you need a third elevator is because once you're getting into World War II, air groups are getting considerably larger, as well as the tempo of operations getting considerably faster. Now, each of your deck elevators bringing your aircraft up from below can only cycle at a certain rate, and they can only lift a certain number of aircraft, usually one, some of the bigger ones could lift 2 at a time, especially if you have wing folding. But nonetheless, you can only cycle aircraft up at a given rate. And equally, you can only cycle them down at a given rate when you're conducting flight operations. And that limits how quickly you can deploy all your aircraft, which turns out to be a very, very vital thing in carrier warfare. And that's coupled with the position of the elevators. If you have 2 elevators, normally, not all the time, but normally, they tend to be positioned either at or very near the ends of the hangar deck. But that, of course, means that if you are conducting flight operations and launching aircraft, you can't use the forward elevator once you actually start launching aircraft, because they're flying over it. Their takeoff run goes right over it. So at that point, you're restricted to only using the rear elevator to supplement the aircraft on deck once you've got your initial deck load up there. And equally, when you're doing landing operations, you can't use the aft elevator because, well, again, landing aircraft have to run over that while they're landing. So you're down to 1 elevator's worth of cycling up and down. Now, obviously, in some navies, there were also considerations about operational procedure that held that once an aircraft landed, it had to be struck below, which also limited the speed at which you could land aircraft, but that's separate to what you could physically do with the elevators available. Now, obviously, if you have 3 elevators, then you can move more aircraft more quickly up or down, which is a good thing. So that increases your cycle time, which is very important, as I said, as the air groups get larger. It also means if one of your elevators is broken or knocked out by enemy action, you aren't having your elevator capacity cut in half. It's only being reduced by a third, which isn't great, but you're reduced back to the elevator efficiency of most other aircraft carriers. And depending on where you position it, then you could potentially either be striking down aircraft at twice the rate during landing operations or bringing aircraft up at twice the rate in takeoff operations. Of course, if you put it dead amidships, then you can't actually use it in either takeoff or landing operations, only when you're initially loading the deck strike, but therefore that's a pretty terrible idea. But there you go. So that's why a 3rd elevator is a good idea. Now, the reason a deck edge elevator is an even better idea, if your design allows for it, like in the Essex class, as you can see here, is because it, to a certain extent, removes considerations of takeoff and landing from the equation. So aircraft are not actually running over the deck edge elevator while they are landing or while they're taking off. So that means that, for example, if you look at the positioning of this one, if you need to strike an aircraft down rapidly during Essex class landing operations, you have 2 options, because it would land, pass over the rear elevator, and then if you absolutely need to strike that aircraft down because maybe you've got too many accumulating on the forward part of your flight deck, you can take 1 aircraft off to your deck edge elevator and another one off to your forward elevator, or you can keep your crash barrier up. You can see the crash barrier actually deployed there on the lowest diagram, and still strike aircraft down using the deck edge elevator. So that, again, will increase your operational speed. And when you're conducting takeoff ops, obviously you can be reloading that stack of aircraft on the aft of your flight deck using the aft elevator. You can't use the front one because that's where aircraft are taking off. But if you suddenly need to bring up a whole bunch of aircraft, like say you're launching a balanced strike package and suddenly radar says, hey guys, there's 250 Japanese kamikazes coming your way. We need every single Hellcat and Corsair you might possibly happen to have airborne right this instant. Then suddenly you can, because bear in mind you are still conducting flight operations, you're still getting aircraft off the deck, so you still can't use your forward elevator. You still have access to 2 elevators because that side elevator can be bringing up fighters. And while you're getting aircraft ready to launch further back, you can bring a fighter up on the deck edge elevator, quickly pull it in, and it's near enough in a position at that stage to be able to take off. Now, there are a lot more considerations about deck edge elevators and so forth, which I said we could go into in a more extensive video, but that's a brief summary of some of the benefits. Brendan Buersdorf asks, why did some nations prefer more rounded turrets while others made theirs squarer, like, say, Austria-Hungary's turrets compared to the Imperial German ones? Broadly speaking, you can round that down into three categories: complexity, weight saving, and internals. Complexity is, in this context, the complexity of the turret structure itself. The more square you build the turret, the more flat plates you can use, and therefore the easier it is to produce. Obviously, the rounder you make your turret, the more complex curves are involved, and therefore the more difficult a casting process and a fitting process that is. So, to a certain extent, it's a reflection in that aspect of how competent your industry is and how much money you want to spend, because obviously a very curved, complex turret is going to cost more to build. Then you have the weight-saving aspect. Now, in that respect, obviously, if you have a little bit of dead space and you can cut that off with a curve, then that's good. That makes the turret overall lighter, but as we just mentioned, it also makes it somewhat more complex. So if you want to use an absolute minimum amount of weight for your turret, either because you want to have lots of turrets, or you want to use that weight for other things on your ship, or perhaps you want a really heavily armoured turret and therefore you want the minimum possible surface area so that you can increase the thickness of the armour, then a more rounded turret in both vertical and horizontal alignments could be a better solution, but maybe more cramped internally, whereas a square turret will give you more space internally, but will also cost you more in overall weight. And then finally you have the internals issue of what exactly are you fitting inside your turret, because let's say particularly if you're looking at Austria-Hungary and Imperial Germany and the other nations of their period, i.e. pre-World War I and World War I, pretty much everybody, except ironically for the Austro-Hungarians and of course the Italians, are using twin turrets for the most part. I mean, yeah, the Russians have the Gangers as well, but, you know, looking at twin turrets generally, obviously you're going to have the gun, the rammers, and the hoists. But then you have to consider, are you going to have auxiliary hoists? Are you going to have ready-use ammunition storage? If you are, how much ready-use ammunition storage? And then, rather critically, especially when it comes to the Imperial Germans, what kind of breech loading mechanism are you going to use? Because on a lot of people's turrets, because obviously this is a Kaiser class that you're seeing in the background, on a lot of people's turrets, you can afford to quite heavily round or otherwise cut down the aft portion of a turret, because there's not a huge amount going on there except for possibly ready ammunition storage and, of course, the counterweight for the forward part of the turret. But for the German designs with the Krupp sliding breech blocks and therefore the brass cartridges, you have to include an entire extraction, conveyance and ejection mechanism for those brass cartridges, which nobody else does. And you can't overlay that in the space of anything else, and therefore that adds a whole extra footprint to your turret, which means the aft section of the turret has to be considerably larger, which lends itself more to that square design. Brian Smith asks, instead of Ranger and the Yorktown class, would it have been easier or cheaper to modify the Lexington class into a treaty-compliant carrier built from the keel up as a carrier? Unfortunately, no. So part of that is just the sheer size of the Lexington-type hull, and part of it is also what the US Navy actually wants in a carrier at the time, bearing in mind that when you're talking about the early 1920s, they're still looking at fairly extensive armouring against cruiser-grade gunfire, at least light cruiser-grade gunfire, so 6-inch, and they're also looking at some fairly hefty deck armament, and that all obviously adds weight. So, for example, if you look at the various carriers the US was sketching up as keel-up carriers, just before the Washington Naval Treaty, you'll notice that anything even approaching the size, or indeed in a few cases perhaps slightly larger than a Lexington, as keel-up carriers are all, roughly speaking, in the 34 to 35,000 ton displacement category. This very rough sketch, which you can see, is something that's drawn up at just over 25,000 tons. So there's a little bit of play if you wanted to build up to the maximum Washington Naval Treaty displacement of 27,000 tons for carriers. But it's not a huge amount. But as you can see, it actually has a waterline length of just under 700 feet. So probably the flight deck would maybe be about 700 feet or so long, which isn't a huge amount compared to, the not quite, but pushing towards 900 feet of the Lexingtons and even the Yorktowns, which are sort of in between these two figures. But as you could probably see from the lower section of the diagrams, this does include quite extensive armor protection. It's not got a belt, admittedly, but there is a very extensive protected deck arrangement over the machinery, etc. going on. And so, yeah, this is a keel-up carrier to US Navy specs at the time. Obviously, it does also have a anti-surface secondary battery, and it's nowhere near the size of the Lexingtons. And in fact, it's not even anywhere near the size of the Yorktowns either. The Yorktowns, bearing in mind, are going to be using no anti-surface armament, unless you technically count the dual-purpose 5-inch guns, and they're very light on protection compared to what the US Navy ideally would want. You'll notice, for example, there is actually a fairly extensive torpedo defense system built into this 1920s design. I mean, it's worth noting that the Essex class approached the Lexington class in size, and indeed technically the long bow Essexes, I think, roughly match the Lexingtons in flight deck length. But even though the Essex class are a keel-up carrier design from almost 2 decades after the Washington Naval Treaty to roughly match the Lexingtons, which is near enough what we're looking at doing here, they still end up displacing a little over 30,000 tons standard, which is 3,000 tons above the Washington Naval Treaty limit of 27,000 tons. Now, granted, you could argue they have a rather obsolete anti-6-inch cruiser defense armor scheme, and that might save some weight, but you're still going to need a fair amount of weight for protection, whether you put that on the hangar deck or the flight deck. It doesn't make much odds. So unless you were going to essentially have the Essex class as a gigantic version of the 1942 light fleet carriers with basically no protection against bombs or torpedoes, and I don't think that's going to work out very well in the era of kamikazes, then it's just fundamentally not possible to get a 27,000 ton aircraft carrier on the dimensions of something approximating the size of a Lexington class. Patrick Donnelly asks, did at any point the Royal Navy's destroyers have an ice cream for pilots scheme set up for rescuing downed carrier pilots in the same manner as the US Navy? Not specifically that I'm aware. Obviously not directly ice cream, because the Royal Navy didn't have ice cream machines aboard the way that the US Navy did. And while carriers might very well be grateful for the recovery of their pilots, there's only so much rum on board Royal Navy ships, believe it or not. However, while I've been looking into the British Pacific Fleet as part of my research for the British Pacific Fleet series, which is still ongoing, by the way, I have come across some reports, letters, etc., that seem to indicate that when it came time for resupply, then destroyers and the occasional submarine, etc., that had performed particular pilot rescue duties, or in the case of some cruisers and so forth, walrus pilots, like you can see here, bringing a downed pilot back aboard a carrier, they do seem to have either got slightly preferential treatment in terms of being able to visit the fleet resupply train first, or in the case where destroyers were topping off supplies from carriers, which was a practice the Royal Navy adopted to a limited degree from the US Navy, well, the ships and subs that had brought some of the pilots back did tend to be, well, let's say, granted somewhat more generosity when it came to which supplies they needed and were granted. Tankodromis asks, if Admiral Henderson realises in 1936 that the 4.5-inch gun isn't going to be available in large numbers, so orders production in mass quantity of the twin 4-inch Mark 16 mounts and the replacement of older secondary guns on large ships, for example, Repulse's triple and single 4-inch mounts will be replaced by as many of these twins as possible, and as many non-anti-aircraft capable destroyer guns are also replaced, so the tribals might have 5 twin 4-inch mounts. What implication would this decision have on World War II? It's a bit of an interesting one, really, because the 4-inch 45 was mass-produced. It just wasn't mass-produced to the sheer demand that was in question. However, obviously, if you kickstart mass production sooner, then you might be able to do so. With that in mind, you have a few interesting implications. For the larger ships, I think there's quite a lot of interesting possibilities for survival. Further on in the question, Tankodromis mentions perhaps Repulse would survive. I mean, if she'd had a straight-up replacement of all of her existing heavy secondaries with twin 4s, I mean, it's possible, as we know, the pincer attack that finally doomed her was a little bit of a last-minute bit of luck by the Japanese Navy, and if she'd been smothered in twin 4-inch AA, all it would have taken would have been 1 or 2 additional hits to various planes, and she might have survived. Basic suppression and removal of the 6-inch secondaries on, say, Bar and Malaya, even Warspite, and the R-class, for example, and then festooning the deck with twin 4-inch as a replacement for that. Well, I mean, none of those were lost to air attack, but a few of them were damaged by air attack, so it might lessen the repair bill if it puts off or destroys a few more aircraft, which might save those ships from 1 or 2 bomb hits. With the destroyers, though, I think there's a little bit more discussion to be had, because the heavy anti-aircraft batteries of ships, whether they be 4, 4.5, 4.7, 5-inch, 5.25-inch, whatever, they generally show more and more lethality as war goes on and better anti-aircraft fire control systems are put in, which includes better mechanical fuse setting prediction and, latterly, in the case of the Allies, the proximity fuse. In the early stages of the war, obviously none of those things really apply. And so the effectiveness of the guns as anti-aircraft guns is going to be somewhat less. Now, of course, something is better than nothing. And for capital ships, obviously, this is a big advantage. However, for destroyers, where this is now their primary armament, they have lesser fire control systems to start with, as a rule, and they're a lot more lively, which it makes aiming somewhat interesting against aircraft. And against that, you have the fact that, yeah, they can fire considerably faster than the 4.7s, but their accuracy in the case of comparing the twin 4 and the twin 4.7s is a little bit less, and of course their range and hitting power is less. And I'm sure some people are going to be going, but Drac, you're always saying that if you have a choice, it's better to have lots and lots of 4-inch or equivalent on a capital ship than a split battery. And I do still stand by that. However, a capital ship generally will have bigger and heftier fire control equipment and is a far more stable gunnery platform, which will mitigate to a certain extent the lesser range and lesser hitting power of a 4-inch compared to a 6-inch, for example, in the split battery case. On a destroyer, where you lack some of that, the limitations of just a 4-inch gun instead of something with a little bit more throw weight do get exacerbated a little bit more. Now, in a situation like the Battle of Narvik, it probably won't make much of a difference. In fact, in the Battle of Narvik, specifically the second one, where the British destroyers run in, so in between the loss of Norgay and Eidsvold and Warspite's appearance, having lots of twin 4s instead of maybe single 4.7s in that particular case might actually be an improvement, because at those ranges, well, you're inside range of either a 4 or 4.7, and you can chuck an awful lot more shells downrange through having both more guns and a faster fire rate. But in some of the more open destroyer combats, it might prove to be a little bit of a disadvantage. And of course, as time goes on and you get better anti-aircraft fire control equipment and, proximity fuses, as well as better regulated mechanical time fuses, which is a product of having better fire control systems, etc., then having those twin 4-inch mounts instead of not really AA capable 4.7s probably will end up being a net benefit. But in the early part of the war, there may be a few cases where people point to engagements that could have gone better if you'd had a heavier and long-range weapon. Rob Smith asks, periodically we see talk of an anti-aircraft battleship with loads of anti-aircraft guns. So what if one replaced the top of a big gun turret with a rotating platform for a number of dual or triple anti-aircraft gun turrets? Obviously, the turret infrastructure would need to be designed to feed shells up to these sub-turrets. So what am I missing in asking why they didn't do this? So as I understand the question, what's being asked is why they didn't stick heavy AA turrets on top of battleship gun turrets. So there's quite a few problems with the idea. The top four are probably going to be complexity, weight, roof armor, and space. So first, complexity. If you're going to have a bunch of additional ammunition chutes, if you've ever been inside the turret of one of, let's say, the US preserved museum ship battleships, because let's face it, that's where most of us are going to see the interior of a battleship turret, there really isn't the space for multiple additional ammunition feeds going up and down through that space, especially if the anti-aircraft turrets are supposed to be able to fully rotate independently of the battleship turrets. And that problem gets even worse if they're not centered on the same point of rotation as the battleship turrets. Then you've got the weight issue. Anti-aircraft guns in turrets, 4, 4.7, 4.55, 5.25, they still weigh a reasonable amount. So if you added one or more of them, you're going to add significantly to the overall weight of the battleship's gun turret setup, which it may or may not be able to take. There are also stability issues, of course, because these things can be raised up quite high. But you're also going to have to be talking about stronger bearings, stronger motors to rotate the whole setup. And of course, that's a bunch of increased weight as well. Then you have roof armor, because of course turrets have roof armor to deflect potential incoming shells. Then it's a reasonable amount of surface area. If you have these things sitting on top, then you, at the very best, have piercings in the roof armor, which are not necessarily a good thing. At worst, possibly very large openings in the roof armor, depending on if you're just punching through for the ammunition hoists. But if you're going to have a rotating platform, that means you've also got rotating machinery up there, and that almost certainly means a turret, a anti-aircraft turret barbette shaped hole in the turret roof armor, which of course is definitely not a good thing if an enemy shell comes calling, especially because obviously that turret will probably have a bunch of ammunition, so it's a ready-made firecracker with a ready-made insert straight into the main gun house. That's not good. And finally, you just have space. So this is why I've chosen this picture. This is the Wyoming, and you can see she's got twin 5-inch 38 mounts in place of some of her twin 12s. And as you can see, they take up a fair bit of space. And okay, yes, it's a twin 12. It's not a triple 14 or a triple 16 or whatever. But realistically, if you're going to stick heavy anti-aircraft guns on top of a battleship's gun turret, you are probably only getting one on there. Two, and they would end up far too close together and mutually interfere unless you're going to do open gun mounts, which I would strongly advise against. So you would get a relatively minimal increase in firepower, and of course you have the problem of, if you have these things aboard, that means you could only really do them either on super firing turrets, where you have a super firing pair, which is going to increase stability problems because that's obviously going to be quite high, or in situations where you have 2 fore turrets and 1 aft turret. Obviously you can stick it on the aft turret, because if you try and stick it on the lower of a super firing pair of turrets, then the super firing turret potentially is going to damage that secondary battery every time it fires, but B is going to have to be elevated quite a bit just to be able to fire above them in the first place. Seb Dove asks, was it ever considered to create a shell capable of detonation near a target vessel, preferably slightly above it, thus showering it with shrapnel to destroy weak points like fire control directors and rangefinders? And if this wasn't a concept looked at by any major powers, could it have been a viable one? I don't believe anyone looked into this on a capital ship scale. In theory, it has a certain degree of merit in that you'd be putting a whole bunch of fragments all across a ship, so the statistical likelihood of hitting something vulnerable like a fire control director or a rangefinder goes up. But you face a couple of big problems on a capital ship scale. Firstly, if you have somehow cheated the statistics gods and managed to actually drop a shell in such a way that its flight path is going to intersect with an enemy capital ship, you're probably more likely to want to take the chance that that shell might go really deep and do something really, really nasty, and therefore you're going to use an armor-piercing shell, not a shrapnel shell. The next issue is that if you have managed to, again, get a shell in this kind of proximity, let's assume for a moment that you're using a high explosive shell, because essentially this kind of shell that you're looking at would be a modified high explosive shell. Another problem is that since they don't have shaped charges in battleship shells, you are going to have an omnidirectional explosion, which means that okay, there's a little bit more mass in the shell forward, but generally speaking, the vast majority of the shrapnel generated by a proximity explosion of a high capacity or high explosive shell is still not going to hit that battleship. At least 50%, even if you're right on top of it, and the further and further away the detonation point gets, the more and more of that shell's fragments are not going to hit. And at the end of the day, a battleship is a very big target, and a shell that weighs a little over a ton is not containing a vast amount of shrapnel relative to that, especially when you consider how little is actually going to hit the ship. In that case, you're probably better off actually having the shell hit and explode, because if you have a high explosive shell that hits and almost instantly explodes, then not only are you going to have a distribution of shrapnel from the shell itself, but also whatever it's hit and whatever is in the immediate vicinity of what it's hit is going to also be turned into a lot of high energy shrapnel, thus significantly increasing the amount of overall shrapnel that's going to be ripping across the target in question, and therefore potentially doing a lot more damage. So on a capital ship versus capital ship engagement scale with the heavy guns, unfortunately I don't think it is a really practical concept. It's technically possible to do, but it would sacrifice so many things compared to what you could do with just a regular armor-piercing shell or even a high explosive shell. It's not really worth considering. With that said, if you were in a knockdown drag-out fight between capital ships, having proximity fuses on your secondary battery might be very useful in this regard, because ultimately a secondary gun, whether it's a 5.25 or 4.7, 5-inch 38, or if you're old school a 6-inch, those guns, let's face it, are not going to do that kind of heavy, vital damage to magazines and machinery spaces that you want out of your main battery armor piercing shells. They're just not going to get through the armor protection. So with that aside, once we've acknowledged that's not happening, well, you're going to use it to shoot up the superstructure, much as ships like Laffey did in the night action of Guadalcanal against Hiei and Kirishima. And if you're going to do that, well, yeah, at that point you might as well use a proximity fuse, because something that's a secondary battery shell size, detonating in relatively close proximity and spraying fragments all over the place, that is probably statistically about as likely to do major damage to fragile bits like radar and fire control equipment as anything else. Yes, you still have the problems of a good chunk of those bits of shrapnel might miss and all the other stuff we outlined for the big guns, but one, as I've said, you're not sacrificing anything in terms of ability to really heavily damage the ship, so might as well. And two, unlike a capital ship high explosive shell, which has enough boom in it that it's going to be ripping up large sections of the superstructure and then propelling them out of shrapnel, ultimately a secondary battery shell, its explosion and shrapnel, if it's detonating on contact, are probably going to be absorbed in relatively close proximity to the site of the explosion. So therefore, detonating it slightly further away and showering things in shrapnel, that might, especially if you're just using essentially your AA shells, that might actually distribute shrapnel over a wider area and therefore increase your chances of doing more damage. Of course, you could also, if you were being really, really, really nasty, adapt the directional shrapnel shells that were used on timing fuses in the First World War against things like trenches and get a really, really nasty effect. But that would require probably a handful of very specialist shells for use in close combat. And finally, Brian Stevens asks, I was wondering about life at sea in the Age of Sail for carpenters as I listened to your show on carpentry and battles. Did trained carpenters join the Navy for this specific job, or was this always on-the-job training, like normal seamen who showed some skill and was then put on that particular track? There are a variety of ways of becoming a ship's carpenter. Obviously, one of the most common was to be apprenticed to an existing ship's carpenter because you happen to show a particular knack for it, or possibly because the carpenter needed an apprentice and you happened to be the nearest, young sign-up that they had. But if you had pre-existing carpentry skills, whether you were from a shipyard or from a more civilian walk of life or whatever, and you happened to want or perhaps need to join the Navy for whatever reason, then you could just turn around and go, hey, I'd like to join the Navy. I have carpentry skills, therefore I'd like to be a ship's carpenter, because it was, essentially an NCO, a non-commissioned or officer posting, so you'd get better pay, you got your own little cabin, and if you didn't like being shot at, then, well, you were generally speaking below the waterline in combat. So, it was a win-win-win as far as you were concerned, as long as you, either wanted to go to sea or you had no real choice over whether or not you were going to sea, then you might as well, if you had those pre-existing skills, volunteer specifically as a ship's carpenter. There might be a lot of reasons for going to sea with carpentry skills. You might just want a change from whatever it is that you're doing at the time, but equally you might be in a little bit of a difficult position because you might have debts or debtors or people you didn't like and didn't like you who were coming after you, at which point skedaddling out to sea for a few years was not a bad option. It's very difficult for them to follow you, and if they did, well, you're on a very heavily armed ship full of people with cannons, so quids in. And that wraps us up for this week. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, if indeed you still are, and I hope to see you again in another video shortly to come.